Thank you. I had begun to say that it was a great privilege to be acting on behalf of Dermot McCarthy, who is the chair of the steering committee of the Irish School of Ecumenics Trust, who cannot be with us today, and has asked me to welcome everyone to this series of webinar in this particular occasion. We are delighted that so many people have chosen to follow this series because it's there to celebrate 50 years of the Irish School of Ecumenics and the Irish School of Ecumenics Trust. I was there on the day when the Irish School of Ecumenics was launched out at the Jesuit Center, and we have had a continuing relationship of many forms since then, over 50 and more years now, in fact, 52 years. The purpose of this celebration is really to give prominence again to the Irish School of Ecumenics in the work that it does, both through its school in Trinity College Dublin and through the trust work, particularly in the north of Ireland. It's a great pleasure to be able to take part in these webinars, to belong to this people who are mostly Irish, but with others also present, and to say how much it is supportive of us to know that so many find these occasions to give satisfaction, to give new thinking that they can enjoy, and to give a sense of fellowship that others are part of the same process. We are most grateful to Gillian King for his wonderful organizing of the seminars, for his support of the thinking that goes into them, and for the good humor with which he actually administers the occasion. And so I hand you over to Gillian Kingston, whom Jim has already announced as the member of the steering committee of the trust and as a vice president of the World Methodist Council, and also the former lay leader of the Methodist Church in Ireland. Gillian, over to you, no better person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Síoltas, for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to see so many people giving up their afternoon to this, and we're delighted to have such a comprehensive and indeed worldwide audience this afternoon. And you're very wise to have gathered around your screens, because we have an absolutely stellar cast. I mean, to continue the star thing, we have a constellation here of people who can really share with us on issues of eco-justice and peace, both on this island where we are and further beyond it. Without any more ado, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to each of them. If you would each sort of wave gently at the audience as I mention your name, that may be helpful. I could say a great deal about each of them, because there's a great deal to say, but I'll leave them to fill in any gaps I may have left. First, I want to introduce you to Professor Frances Flannery. She is the Professor of Religion at James Madison University, and cogent to us here in Ireland, she is a Trinity College Long Room Hub Visiting Research Fellow for this year, 2022. She's a biblical scholar with a very wide-ranging background in humanities, science, and the arts. She is in control of a number of languages, but I hope she's going to really speak through English today. But she can manage Biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, Attic, Koine Greek, Syriac, French, and German, but it will be English. Her current focus is on the eco-theology that addresses the relationship of earth, human, and non-human animals. So Frances, we really look forward to hearing you. We're also delighted to welcome Matt Williams. Matt is a director of Jubilee Farm, which is in Northern Ireland, up near Larne. Jubilee Farm defines creation care, which is all we're about today, as an environmental and agricultural stewardship that incorporates fairness, flourishing, welfare, and well-being, Matt, that's pretty comprehensive, and we look forward to you addressing this. Next, we have Karen Jeffares from Síolta Chroí, and we're delighted to have you, Karen. You've got a human rights activist background in a number of communities: Northern Ireland, Mexico, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Colombia. So as we look at eco-justice on the island of Ireland and beyond, you can certainly supply a great deal of the beyond. We really look forward to hearing you. And you hold an MPhil in International Peace Studies from none other than the Irish School of Ecumenics. Zand, we're very glad to welcome you, Alexander, properly, but Zand for us. You are working in assignments in the world's Green Building Council's Building Life Policy Advocacy in 10 countries in Europe. We'll be interested to hear that, because building is such a critical thing at the moment in so many of our centres of population. But you began your career in Northern Ireland, and not least in Corrymeela, and that has deeply influenced you, your experiences of growing up in Northern Ireland, and you see climate change as one of the critical issues of today. So we look forward to hearing about that. And last but not least, Jake Erickson. Jake, you are in Trinity College at the moment, and you're waving to us with the yellow hand. That's very helpful. You're teaching theological ethics here, and you've been here for the last 6 years, I gather. You previously taught in the States and along the lines of religion and environmental college studies, and you explore fundamental questions related to living in the wake of climate change. So as you can hear, sisters and brothers, we have a very erudite panel who will be able to address many of our concerns once we have listened to them talk about what some of the challenges are in the work that they do, the challenges today in issues of eco-peace, eco-justice and peace. So Frances, may I invite you first to talk to us for 5 or 6 minutes about this?
Thank you so much. I really want to thank you, Gillian Kingston and Dr. Dong Jin Kim and the Irish School of Ecumenics for this invitation. It is truly an honor to be here representing James Madison University, the Trinity Long Room Hub, and also our nonprofit BioEarth. And I'll be speaking quite a lot about BioEarth today. And I commend all of you and the ISE for focusing this part of the Jubilee celebration on the theme of eco-justice, since climate change is the greatest threat to world peace that exists, with profound implications for security, justice, and equity. Can I ask, is my sound okay since I'm first? Okay, great. So I'm going to put the challenge in stark but realistic terms. We're at a unique crossroads in human history, in which our actions will determine whether the next 50 years see the transformation of our way of life into a new era of resiliency that can face the climate crisis, or whether there will be unparalleled catastrophe that can threaten human civilization. As the US Pentagon concluded as much as 7 years ago, the climate crisis is the greatest threat to the US, even more so than terrorism or war, and it is indeed a greater threat to security in Ireland and the rest of the world than even the prospect of global war. So let me begin by very briefly sketching the state of the climate crisis and its relationship to eco-justice. I felt I should do that since I went first, so forgive me for running over about 30 seconds. What the next 50 years will look like for Ireland and for the world depends on which course we take in the next 3 to 8 years, as laid out in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for 2022, the IPCC report for short, in which hundreds of scientists from 195 member nations synthesize evidence from 14,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers. I mention this at the outset because part of the challenge in meeting the climate crisis is communicating effectively with the public to overcome the distractions of bad fringe science and inaccurate media reporting. So the next IPCC report is due out this September, but reliable information has been leaked early because the situation is so dire and the time is so short. The challenge is severe for the whole world. To protect civilization as we have known it, we would have to stay within what's called a guardrail of 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global average temperature by century's end. To achieve this goal, we need to cut our global carbon footprint, our emissions, by 50% in 8 years and bring it to zero net carbon in 30 years. This will require a front-loaded investment in infrastructure, and the cost is equal to half of global corporate profits. It will be a cost that is borne unequally. So here's the most realistic situation. We're not going to make it. In fact, we're going to cross this guardrail of 1.5 degrees Celsius, not in 2100, but in 3 years from now. On our present path, we are likely headed for about 4 degrees Celsius rise in average temperature by century's end. I have reasons for that figure, but it seems like a small difference, but it isn't. On our present path in 30 years, we are facing the generation of 250 up to 1 billion climate migrants, vast ocean dead zones, and the loss of perhaps 1.5 million species. On our present path, 80 years from now, most of the world will be uninhabitable. This is due to sea level rise, temperatures beyond the livable human extreme, drought, flooding, superstorms, and then the secondary causes of food scarcity, water scarcity, more conflict, more war, mass migration. So the surviving humans will be concentrated by 2100 above the 49th parallel to the north. So that's northern France and above, and about the 49th parallel to the south, and that's Antarctica. So while Ireland lies in this habitable zone, which is great because the US doesn't, imagine the whole remaining population of the planet pretty much living at that latitude and above. And moreover, it will be a different ecosystem where we will probably have lost about 50% of the world's species. Now, this very bleak picture, and we will move on in part 2 to some ways of dealing with that. So please don't descend into total climate grief quite yet. But this bleak picture still ignores the issue of eco-justice. And so I think that the climate crisis is actually going to be this bad because of eco-justice, because the climate crisis impacts Indigenous peoples and the peoples of the poorest nations the most. Right now, the bulk of the world's biodiversity, 85%, is protected under just 5% of the world's population, Indigenous peoples. But as these peoples are impacted first and mostly more than anyone else, I heard the ethnobotanist Dr. Rosalind Lapierre, who is also an Indigenous woman, say that it is misleading to say that climate change is caused by humans. Climate change is caused by some humans. It's primarily caused by China, the US, India, Russia, Japan, and Germany. And it's misleading to say that climate change will affect us all because it will affect Indigenous people and people from the poorest nations disproportionately to everyone else. So let me reframe the idea of climate crisis challenge somewhat differently. Knowing what will happen with the climate crisis is not the challenge. We have the data. We know what's coming. Knowing what we ought to do to avert catastrophe is not the challenge. We know what we need to do. Cut global carbon emissions by 50% in 8 years and cut it to zero by 2050. So if we know where we're headed and we know what we need to do, what are the obstacles to actually doing it? And I'd like to just list 5 in my remaining time. First, changing our way of life will take unprecedented cooperation at the grassroots and the governmental levels in a world full of conflict, strife, war, partisanship, and there will be resistance from those who've benefited economically from the previous way of life. 2, there is widespread mistrust in authorities and information sources, and many from the public do not know how to separate good evidence from bad propaganda. 3, we face an educational and communication crisis, including scientists who can't speak to the public a public who is largely illiterate in science, and a media that can't translate science into ordinary language. 4, those who do believe the data will experience some level of climate anxiety and climate grief that can paralyze us and lead to inaction and fear. And 5, there are religious obstacles. This is the area I work on the most, especially apocalyptic thinking, which is characteristic of the fastest growing denominations of Christianity in the world. Consider for a moment how this plays a role in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is vital to the world's weather system because it has 2 of the world's largest rainforests and the largest wetland in the whole world. And DRC is one of the poorest nations in the world with a per capita income of $800 a person. So the pressures to drill under that wetland and to cut down that rainforest are vast. Now enter apocalyptic religion, and 40% of the populace is evangelical, and not the kind of evangelicalism that promotes the kind that we're going to be talking about with Jubilee Farm's creation care theology, but rather the kind that looks at signs of climate change and then concludes these are signs of the end time and nothing should be done. This also, this kind of apocalypticism also affects the United States. A recent survey, well, it's about 10 years old now, had 41% of our population answering that Jesus would probably come by 2050. So the apocalyptic worldview does not translate easily into a long-term commitment to leave a healthy planet for our children. And we'll talk about some options in part 2.
Thank you very much indeed, Frances. It is a sobering and indeed a frightening picture. And I note that our next speaker, Matt, was nodding vigorously at some of the things you have been saying. So Matt, over to you to pick up on perhaps some of Frances' concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. And I think I'll probably take a slightly more local perspective than Frances, although there are things that came up that I could maybe address later, especially during the Q&A. But yeah, thanks, Frances, and thanks for teeing up my theological perspective as well, because that's actually what I want to begin with. I probably should give a slightly more of a background to Jubilee Farm itself before saying much more. I'm grateful to be included in this panel, and to all you who invited me to take part, representing Jubilee Farm, East Antrim. So in the northeastern part of the island of Ireland, and you'll already be a bit disappointed by my accent, which is, well, it's nothing really anymore. I'm originally Welsh, actually. I've moved around a fair bit. Family have been in Northern Ireland since 1994, and I myself have been involved in Jubilee Farm since its inception, way back in 2015, 2016, but I've also lived in England during most of the time of the life of Jubilee Farm. So I'm an insider and an outsider, which I think can be a disadvantage, but can also be an advantage. And Jubilee Farm is a good concrete place from which to speak, because I think what I want to highlight is this tension between local action and community and concrete events, and the very global issues such as Frances has been pointing out. So I want to base a lot of what I say actually on the words of an extremely ancient hymn that a lot of you probably recognize some of these words. So I want to read these words. The Son is the invisible, the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. In him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's the head of the body, the church, and he's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. It's a very ancient hymn that some of you will recognize from the book of Colossians. And I think where we start from in this is mercifully not a place of complete lostness and disorientation, but we're actually starting from something that has been done in a specific time and place in the physical body of Christ. And looking back on what Christ has done is not only immensely hopeful as a starting point, but it's actually the physicality that I want to highlight, because the physicality of Christ opens up the reality of his full humanity, which can't exist outside of the ecological and social interrelationships in which all of human life is embedded. And likewise, the reconciliation of all things, it includes the fragmented parts of damaged creation. And it also is explicitly about making peace. I don't know if you noticed that, that line of Paul's. This is about the establishment of peace. So we're working from a very physical, ecological, and social understanding of the finished work of Christ in making peace. And so the question is, how does this work in practice within a world that still clearly suffers under hostility and fragmentation? And what role can the local and concrete have in the global and even cosmic situation we have? Well, Jubilee Farm is a very specific place. It's a very specific community in the specific area of East Antrim. And what we see is this cosmic reconciliation actually can take place. People are working together to cultivate this land. And wherever they're from, they come and they live out this message of what God's already done in all its messiness, all its mistakes. And the three things that we do play into this in three different ways. We've got community-supported agriculture, which basically means that people are involved in the production of the food that they themselves get to eat. We have volunteers, an increasing team of volunteers that come down and actually work the land together. So even though they don't have their own farmlands, they make Jubilee Farm their own farm. We do care farming, which involves having asylum seekers from all over the world who have tragically been displaced. Some of these people that Francis referred to end up in Belfast, and they'll come each week, and part of often the healing and the therapy that they experience is done through participation in the work of the farm, in the community that's being built there. And we do conservation, education, and engagement as well, which includes addressing some of the ways in which the environment and specifically agriculture and environment working together can be taught often to classes of primary school children, or more broadly now that we're able to open a bit more to the public, to others as well. So in this very sort of small 13.5 acre farm, there's actually an achievement and a happening of this reconciliation and making peace, which includes not just people from the two sides of the divided community in Northern Ireland, the Catholic and Protestant, but much more broadly than that at a global scale as well. But what's been great is how this passage in Colossians itself has been a site for reconciliation. And before we had a physical farm, all we really were as Jubilee Farm was a meeting of people who would talk and pray and look forward to how to establish this project. And I conducted a little meeting on the Falls Road, which some of you know about in Belfast. And as someone who's, I wouldn't classify myself as Protestant in the normal way, but I went to Protestant school, and if anything, that's the side of community I'd be identified with. And on the Falls Road, having a little meeting with 4 or 5 of the nuns in one of the convent there. And I was slightly nervous about how they'd react to my interpretation of this particular passage, but we just read it together and prayed, and they were just so open and grateful. It was a beautiful moment of actually being reconciled around the reading of scripture together, and particular scripture which encouraged us, I think, against certain interpretations of the Bible, to take creation care extremely seriously. And so we see that the two sites of real conflict, both the land and the interpretation of scripture, can actually become sites of reconciliation, and specifically eco-justice, because of the context we're in, that you cannot exclude the land from reconciliation. So plenty more I can say about the specific ways in which this works out, and the challenges that we face in bringing these things together, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of things which we're trying to bring together, a lot of things which stand in some tension to each other, even in terms of human resources. but I'll leave it there to maybe say a bit more in the next section about the challenges and ways of addressing that. Thanks, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was fascinating and presented another perspective. So we turn now to you, Karen. And all is quiet in your background, I take it, at the moment. You did warn me that you might have a small person looking for your attention.
All is quiet. I hear happy hums from next door, so we should be fine for the next short while.
I see.
We may have a visitor. Well, thank you, Gillian, and thank you so much, Francis and Matt. It's very interesting to hear your perspectives, and yeah, there's a lot of similarities actually, Matt, with our work and yours as well. So I actually won't speak too much about those things. As Gillian mentioned in the introduction, I've done a great deal of work mainly in Latin America, and working mainly with communities, grassroots communities on the ground. And so I'll actually start a little bit there. What I was drawn to speak about upon Dong Jin Kim's invitation to this roundtable was this piece about interconnectedness. And that's where I'd like to focus, if that's okay. And I'm open to any question about anything afterwards as well. And so, yes, this piece of interconnectedness in terms of what society needs to deal with now, what we all need to deal with on a global level and on a local level, the challenges that we're facing, and also those opportunities. So in the work that I was doing in my journey, essentially, I began with non-violent conflict resolution, essentially alongside communities in Latin America. And I would have done a great deal of political advocacy, spent about 10 years, over a decade in that area, really, trying to support people at risk. And the majority of those people, like there's land rights defenders, environmental defenders, people essentially, yes, as Francis mentioned, the people in the global south being the people who will feel the impacts of climate change and of these conflicts that are going to arise, that are arising already. And so we would have been working alongside these individuals and organizations, becoming very familiar with their struggles. And actually, after about 10 years of this, of hearing the same struggle coming up again and again, defenders at risk, human rights defenders, environmental defenders, land rights, indigenous defenders, all of these different conflicts, at some point, it all sort of interconnected in a way that it hadn't done for me before. And it was at a talk of a similar, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, actually, there was an interesting talk from different defenders in Latin America and how their communities are dealing with the pandemic. And that was the purpose of the talk. But one of the speakers at the talk is a feminist indigenous woman from Colombia. And she was speaking about the damage to the soil, essentially. And she was talking about the damage to the earth and to the ecosystem. And she was speaking about its roots and the root causes of this being in this interconnectedness, or the opposite of interconnectedness, but this disconnection between humans and wider nature. And this is essentially the work that I found myself in now. So for me, that was a huge piece of interconnection in terms of that it is connected, basically. So we have our disconnection from wider nature, our space within the ecosystem, our understanding, and this is all well documented and studied in terms of different types of thought and philosophies in the modern world, but we've somehow separated ourselves from nature. And so we think we're above it, we think we're separate to it, but ultimately we're part of it. And this is what we're seeing now, and this is what one of the great chances we have now, I think, is that we will get an opportunity to see how deeply connected we are. And hopefully this will also provide opportunities and chances to overcome the problems that we have. However, I suppose in terms of Síolta Chroí, which is the Irish for Seeds of the Heart, this is the organization that I'm involved in now. the way we see the root causes of many of the problems that we have in our societies that are making it difficult for us to step up and respond to the problems outlined by Francis earlier. Yes, the problem being this disconnection, but also this problem of, of the different changes. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous, apologies. The different changes that need to occur. So we work in 3 different areas, and those areas are regenerative cultures, regenerative food systems and resilient food systems, and the third is ecosystem restoration. What we believe is that actually change is possible. We have a very, very hopeful outlook for the future. We think that by connecting back with one another and with the soil, in particular with the land, that we will be able to meet the challenges of climate change full on. Ultimately, if we can see our interconnection, ultimately, if we can see one another in the way that that we should be seen, which is brothers and sisters connected together, like humans on the planet, and then our space within the ecosystem, this gives us an opportunity then to respond and to move forward in that way. Right. So yeah, essentially it's this separation from wider nature that we see as one of the problems, and the opportunities to respond to it follow on from there. I'm going to pass back to you now, Gillian, if that's okay. Just
Well, thank you very much, Karen, because I think that picks up very much on what Francis and Matt have been saying, and this interconnectedness with the earth. It's such a vital thing to have as a backdrop for everything we're discussing. So we move on to you, Zand, if we may, please. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say with great interest.
Sure, thanks very much, Gillian, and hello everybody. Can you hear me okay? Just give me a quick thumbs up if you can hear me. Yep, good. Actually, just first thing I want to do before I unpack some of what I can share is, given what's been shared, and maybe this is actually one of the challenges sometimes, is that we both need to go very fast with some of these challenges that have been framed. And also, I think we need to slow down sometimes. So I actually want to invite you just to take a breath for yourself. You've actually just heard a lot of quite heavy, deep information, which at one level can be, for me, often when I come back to this, I really feel this in my body, and I've been working in this space for a while, it can be quite unsettling. So I just want to invite you, just in your own time, just to take a deep breath in, and then release that out. And maybe for a moment, just feel your feet on the floor in the room that you're in. And even just take a moment just to look around you. And with that frame that we just got around Karen gave us around being connected to nature, maybe just look around the room that you're in for a moment and find something in your gaze that is of nature. Could be anything that you notice in that space. Yeah, so just as we sit as humans in this space at this time, facing these challenges together around this little campfire, this little circle, just want to invite you into a little bit of being in your body and your humanness for a moment. So where to go? I'm gonna give you, so a little bit of my background, maybe just to give you a little bit of context and maybe why I'm on the call, is maybe bridging also off what Francis spoke to, is I guess I'm at one level a young person-ish from the global north and from some of the countries who are really responsible, certainly in terms of the climate crisis, for a lot of where we are. And I've been working through organizations like JPIC, which is a climate innovation organization coming out of the European Commission, trying to shift a lot of systems, food systems, energy systems, urban mobility, transportation, the built environment sector, away from the trajectory that we're on, and really trying to lean into Climate Kick's whole premises around transformation in time, which is also really around the timeframes that maybe we're facing into with some of certainly the climate crisis, and at least trying to move in that direction. So I've kind of been on the ground doing work in those spaces, and I'm now working with climate litigation and with the Foundation for International Law for the Environment.
So some challenges that I see, and I'll be brief on some of these and we can maybe dig deeper that kind of tie off some of the stuff. So the first really that I want to point at, and it's already come up, but really is when I think particularly in this environment with who's on the call, is breaking down a little bit of the distinction between eco and peace. That really, when we begin to dive into the climate crisis, that really we're looking at that as a systemic driver of conflict and destabilization around the world, and that they are deeply, deeply linked. In essence, if you look at the climate crisis, you're basically disrupting the hydrological cycle and shifting the temperature cycles around the world, which have then a knock-on impact, obviously, on food systems, on water scarcity, on all sorts of questions like that around the world. And you don't need to go too far down that line to think around scarcity and rivalry of then the competition and destabilization that happens in that sense. I think really just to give a very stark example of that right now is that there's a very significant heat wave moving through India at the moment, which has significantly impacted the wheat crop in India. Obviously, India has a population of over 1 billion people, and obviously we've already had, with the war in Ukraine, which is also a huge breadbasket in Europe, a destabilization of grain supplies around the world. And just a little bit of statistics is that on the 16th of May, Prime Minister Modi decided to stop exports of wheat outside of India, which jumped global grain prices about 6%. And they've already risen about, I think it's about 43% since the beginning of the year because of the war in Ukraine, which threatens the food security for many nations around the world, particularly which are poor nations, which depend on bread as a core staple. And one of these includes Pakistan, which is obviously a neighbor, and both India and Pakistan obviously already have tensions, both nuclear powers. You can see kind of some of where this all has the potential to go. And I think the war in Ukraine is also just an example of, if we tip into war, the destabilization that also creates, whether it's created through climate change or through other factors. We're just in a very precarious position. So I think the key thing for me there is to see those things as very linked. And in many ways, if you work in peace work, this is kind of conflict prevention, conflict navigation work in a very deep sense. So I think that's one piece that's just very alive for me as a challenge. But I often see those communities siloed as the environmental community and the peace community, and that they don't always work together very well. And the peace community focuses on people, and the other environmental community tends to be framed as looking at polar bears or something like that versus working together. So I think there's a real reach out across the divide there that I see as very important. And then maybe just to zoom in locally without going too deep into these, is if we're talking about transformation in time, I'm back in Northern Ireland right now. Without stable governance, which is obviously fueled by our existing tensions and conflict, it's very hard to have the level of collaboration and structural change that we need to actually transition a lot of the systems that we need to change at any level of scale, which is a big problem for Northern Ireland. Without Stormont up and running, it's very hard to have local policies around resilience. And the climate bill, for example, is kind of stalled at the moment because it can't move further through Stormont because we don't have a government, which means we can't set targets and we can't move forward on a lot of big issues. And then finally, obviously, the other big challenge that I see really in this space is just transition. For example, the EU in its Green New Deal plan coming post-COVID is investing about 600 billion into green transition. And the big question there is winners and losers, and who will be recipients of that money. And will it just be widen inequality gaps, and the people who already have skills to participate in that type of an economy will have access to those types of ecological benefits, green benefits, whereas there'll be low-income communities that are left out. So there's a big question of how do we create a green economy that lifts all boats and create pathways for people into not just spending money in a green economy, but also earning money in a green economy and finding dignified, meaningful work in that transition, which I think is also a big question for post-conflict Northern Ireland as we create a shared future, is how do we invite communities from people who or communities that have been traditionally affected by the conflict into that journey along with us. So I will pause there because I think I've taken quite a bit of time and we can dig into more of that if you want to later. But thank you for having me and happy to dig in more.
Thank you very much, Zand, and forgive us for interrupting you in the middle when you were in full flight, as it were, with the technical issue, but that is so much better, and we were able to hear you so clearly. And what you said, we need to hear clearly, mentally and spiritually, as well as physically. And so last, but absolutely not least, Jake, we come to you, please.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And thanks to Jen for this invitation and for all of you taking the time to be here. It's an important topic to me, both personally and scholarly. And so I think one of the, I'm not going to throw data at you since we've gotten some good background on that already. But I think I might tell a little bit of the story about how this becomes an important topic to me, because I think it connects with how I see the challenges that we're moving in and toward. I grew up on a farm in the western part of the state of North Dakota in the United States, which is towards the geographical center of North America, and it is prairie, largely agricultural land with histories of settler colonialism and Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples in the place that I grew up. As a farm kid, I grew up around animals far more than people, usually, and had a grandfather who had a deep passion for ecological care, animal care, and was on the National Park Service Advisory Board under President Carter. And so someone who was deeply politically active and also connecting the daily practices of that farm work in day-to-day modes. And so I had a model for someone who cared about their local ecological context growing up. Going off to college and then to do my Master's of Divinity, I had this awkward experience and sad experience of writing and studying theology and ethics and on the East Coast, and coming back to my homeland only to discover that the Bakken oil formation was beginning to be fracked and drilled, and to see the very landscape that comprised my own spiritual, ethical, social landscape, my own sense of self and body, to see that slowly ripped apart over the course of a number of years and replaced with fracking wells, some providing jobs for the very friends and family that I grew up with, and some destroying the very landscape and the histories of peoples that I adored. And so the emergence of fossil fuel economy in that particular local context, made visible in ways that it was already invisible, paired with growing consciousness of the effects of climate change. At that time, we were simply usually talking about how do we stop climate change from happening in the first place? How do you prevent it? And began to notice more and more of my friends who are more ecologically attuned talking about the effects that we're already experiencing, and it rung true to my own ecological and social experience. And so I tend to approach climate justice, eco-justice, with a sense that one of the crises that we're facing is what I'd call a kind of crisis of planetary intimacy. It's an intimate crisis, as abstract as it can be. It's a deeply intimate crisis to me and my body, to my communities, to my sense of history, and that we're more aware of the intimate effects of ecology, water quality, food, the effects of weather, of our planetary life together on a larger scale than we ever have before. We're kind of overwhelmed by that intimate experience, even as it may be abstract in the ways that we talk about climate ethics sometimes, or climate change, or ecological justice. There's a coming to consciousness of more ecological and social and scientific and planetary connections. We know and are constantly becoming aware of the vast biodiversity of the planet, becoming aware of new biological discoveries, new species, and at the same time recognizing that so many species are being snuffed out day in and day out, so much so that we don't even know and couldn't even name the species that have gone extinct during our times together. We don't know how to understand ourselves as intimately ecological. I always tell my students that it's only animals that do theology, and to move beyond simply imagining ourselves as human beings with a kind of special, exceptional status in the world, even as we might have particular responsibilities within it, is deeply important. To imagine that the human animal is something that's in this space is hard for us to do. We don't know how to understand ourselves as intimately related to each other's social lives on a local level, increasingly in the vast ways that our local communities are being rent apart. The experience of COVID exacerbated some of these experiences for us of unraveling social connection. We don't know how to really wisely think about the interconnections of our local living, always on a local scale, with the planetary impacts that it has. And we don't know how to understand ourselves as intimately related as both individuals and as systems. And those are big philosophical questions that have occupied a lot of folks across time and space, but yet the intensity of those questions in the midst of climate injustice is so much greater. So it's really, for me, it's a crisis of intimacy, but it's a crisis of imagination as well. And I find that one of the things that is so needed is a bolder imagination of what might be possible. That might tilt into some of the suggestions for how we wrestle with some of these things, but I think a couple of the challenges that emerge that I can talk a little bit more about later is that firstly, listening. One of the first, it's been mentioned here a little bit, one of the first things that I find is that when folks come to consciousness of the ecological or climate crisis, they want to do something really urgently right away. And that's an important piece of what is required of us in this particular point in time. And yet, the act of listening to folks who, Native folks, to local climate leaders, to people who have been involved in thinking about these issues for a long time is a deep challenge and needs to be thought about first. I always think of the philosopher and theologian Nell Morton, who talks about our duty to one another as being to hear one another to speech. And I think that's something that we're not able to do really well. And then secondly, I'll talk more about solutions in a bit, but secondly, out of that intimacy, imagination, the crisis of listening as a kind of eco-social justice action, dealing with histories of decolonization and the reality that the climate crisis is not a particular thing that has happened within the course of our own limited lifetimes, that it came before us and it will be there long after us. And this question of how do we deal with an inherited problem that we also participate in, and how do we think about what we are to pass down to those who come after us, both human and non-human. My own experience in North Dakota on settler colonial lands reminds me that, of course, in many parts of the globe, European, North American contexts, African, Australian contexts, that the histories of European colonization and settler colonialism were precisely acts of ecological terror for Native peoples, for the land. And in fact, not only that, but I think of the Standing Rock Sioux scholar Vine Deloria, who talked about how, I'll quote him from Custer Died for Your Sins, that various Lutheran bodies do not share communions or pulpits today. The Roman Catholics and Episcopalians are always engaged in a brawl. Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists continually struggle over concepts of congregational sovereignty. Yet 100 years ago, these churches deliberately ceded various tribes, nations, to doctrines they considered as heretical, in order to gain a captive audience from the federal government for local colonization. That is to say that the destruction of native peoples and the history of settler colonialism might be articulated, as this particular scholar says, as one of the greatest ecumenical movements the world has ever seen. And how do we deal with deconstructing that particular history that is precisely involved in the extraction of peoples and fossil fuels and bodies, and have caused the ecological crisis as we know it? That's up there.
Thank you very much indeed, Jake. I think those of us who've been listening to the five of you will have had a picture that we hope now you will help us in a way to solve, because you've presented us with the challenges and the issues, and now we yearn to hear you talk about how these issues and challenges can be overcome. But let me just rehearse some of what you have said. Francis, you pointed out to us some of the really frightening statistics. You presented the framework within which we are living, you know, the time scale, and the importance of taking this on board. Matt, it was really helpful to hear you lodge this in scripture for us, particularly in that wonderful paean of praise that comes out of the letter to the Colossians. So thank you for that. And thank you for telling us something about how Jubilee Farm is actually working on this, on what you said is actually a fairly small farm at 13.5 acres, indeed. Karen, thank you for talking about that, the interconnectedness of things. I think that was very important, and you're linking with the communities in other countries. I think that is so important, that we take on board our responsibility, how we live in the Northwest and how it's affecting people elsewhere. So thank you for that. Zand, you talked about going faster and slowing down, which was an interesting idea. And I think it was very helpful to hear you talk about how easily war, such as we are experiencing it, many of us for the first time so close to home, how war can tip the balance in other things. And I think your use of the word tipping was good. Jake, you gave us some really interesting quotable quotes. I will have to reflect on how I may use the phrase planetary intimacy, but it sounds really good. And I was struck by when you talked about active listening, how we need to hear each other to speech. And you finished off with a very interesting phrase indicating that this is, as certain actor and father Ted says, this would be an ecumenical matter. And so it is. And we are grateful to you for telling us that. And so now I'd like all five of you, in the same order in which you spoke before, to turn around and help us to see how we may overcome some of the issues that you've identified. Francis, how do we cope with those statistics?
Well, first, I wish I could go right now to coffee with every one of you. That was amazing. Thank you for having me as part of this panel. There's so much more to talk about. I had outlined 5 challenges, and I want to briefly run through some of the projects that our nonprofit BioEarth is proposing to deal with these, and also to work talk a little bit about my work at Trinity College as a visiting research fellow, and the book that I'm writing. So first of all, the really big one for me is that meeting the climate crisis will take unprecedented global cooperation. So BioEarth's contribution to this is something called the 1 Billion for Peace Pledge. You can find it at www.bioearthcommunity.com. I'll put it in the chat in a moment, but I would love it if everybody would take a moment to look at it later, because it is an intention setting tool that we invite all of you to sign and hopefully to share, in which you commit to pursuing peace in your life. That's it. The pledge states that to be sustainable and lasting, peace must include not just the physical and the material dimensions of well-being, but also the psychological, cultural and religious, and ecological well-being of peoples. It teaches us and you can say it on one human hand, it teaches us that we're all living in one giant ecosystem and we're interdependent. What we do affects one another, and that we need in every project to consider each of these dimensions, or we might make things worse. This definition of peace actually came out of my work on apocalyptic terrorism and security studies. But this definition of peace is not partisan, and this 1 billion for peace pledge is not partisan. It is not limited to a particular faith. It doesn't spell out how to achieve peace or present disagreements. It's aimed at the foundation, sort of the first step. How do we get lots of people, at least 1 out of 7 of us, to agree that peace is our goal at this crucial moment in history? And by committing to this pledge, we're committing to peaceful dialogue, even as we disagree, because it's going to take a lot of discussion and disagreement. And how are we going to determine what the next steps are if the foundation isn't we're committing to peace? I like that you brought up COVID. Can't remember who that was now. I think it was Karen. But COVID and climate change have both taught us that, yeah, it was Karen. It was about interconnectedness. And COVID and climate change have both taught us we are so interconnected that we breathe the same air, right? This is the issue in both cases. We can't privilege benefits to one group of people at extreme cost to another, or in the end, somehow systemically we will suffer. So the 1 billion for peace pledge has that component of cultural and religious well-being, and we're maintaining that's essential to peace because it addresses all the other challenges, or it can address all the other challenges that I mentioned, which again, briefly, we're creating trust and good information, playing a role to educate the public with reliable climate science, counteracting climate grief and climate despair, and creating alternatives to passive apocalyptic thinking. So I want to give you a couple concrete examples of how religion can do this. First of all, religion, yes, it can be an obstacle to environmental care, but it can be a solution to crisis. The greatest environmental writing of our lifetimes is Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, on care for our common home. By 2060, 1/3 of the Earth's population will be either Muslim or Christian, and Islam has its own rich environmental theology, which I won't talk about today. But at the present time, Catholicism is still the largest Christian denomination. So there's enormous room with Laudato Si to convey an impactful environmental message. And by the way, his vision of environmental care is systemic. It calls for equitable distribution of wealth, care for the poorest among us, the rejection of a cultural consumption, which on a spiritual level leaves us bankrupt, and it on a material level wastes resources. Anyways, so one example of the possible impact of Laudato Si is our project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which we call BioCongo. 50% of Congolese are Catholic, and we're beginning to work with a local nonprofit, Vijana Africa, which in Swahili is Youth of Africa, to help build a school and build a curriculum to introduce climate change education, but also practical resilient projects that can foster resiliency. And here I'm thinking about Síolta Chroí, did I say it correctly? And also Jubilee Farm. And that kind of approach to promote resiliency. And putting it all in a framework of Laudato Si allows us to have access to 50% of the population. And then when we think about evangelicalism, which I brought up, that dominion theology of historical Christianity that says humans are created at the top of a hierarchy, and we're put in charge of all the animals, we can exploit them any way that we want. First of all, there's the creation care theology within that, and it's very potent because it's biblically based and environmental, and I'll let Matt speak more to that. But it takes very seriously that humans are created to till and tend the earth. So what I would say, and in some of my own work, I've been looking at the Bible to say that dominionist theology is not actually biblical. It is a colonial interpretation. It's come out of a certain European tradition. We've heard it over and over and over, but when you go back to the biblical Hebrew, that's not really what I think it's saying. So I'm trying to open up those texts in new ways in my book, The Climate Covenant. And then I just want to point out that in both Catholic and Protestant examples, religion can be a huge resource, not only for dealing with fostering trust in authorities and climate change education, but also for addressing climate grief and building community by bringing people together around a shared goal and shared values. And so we also have a project I may have a chance in the third part to talk some more about if anybody's interested, which is a BioVillage project in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. I'd love to talk to the two directors of the farms here. Our inspiration was Clock Jordan here in Tipperary. It's what first brought me to Ireland. And the 1 Billion for Peace pledge forms our lens of assessment for how we're going to co-create conflict resolution practices, decision-making, shared value statements. In other words, taking that human component of the eco-village really seriously, which is why we call it a BioVillage. I'd like to just kind of wrap up with two things. One of our mottos is local plus local equals global. And when I hear about some of the actual projects that are going on that we heard about here today, I realize, you know, our nonprofit, we can't do it all. Your nonprofit, we can't do it all. But when we put all of us together, and I would suggest that our 1 Billion for Peace pledge is a good framework for that, because it's a conceptual tool that cements our commitment to peace, but it doesn't lock us into a particular step or faith or partisan view. But many hands make light work. I don't know if you know that expression here. Many hands make light work. And so when we think about more Síolta Chroí, when we think about Jubilee Farms, when we think about our BioVillage, but also when we think about all these other local projects, our work in Congo, our curriculum in our school, all of it together is an environmental peace movement. We just have to start looking at it that way. And then finally, the last thing is, as a biblical scholar, the work that I'm doing is thanks to Jake Erickson for sponsoring me to come here and work with the Long Room Hub. I'm so grateful. My book, The Climate Covenant, is trying to take seriously an ecological theology that starts from the viewpoint, we are nature. So what does that look like? Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Frances. You're already, by referencing your colleagues on the panel, you are picking up interconnectedness in a very significant way. Matt, would you like to continue?
Yeah, thank you. I'm very aware that it's always easier in some ways to talk about challenges than solutions. And it can be glib sometimes talking about solutions, but I suppose at least approaches to challenges I like to highlight. I think I'd want to shape the challenge that we're talking about in a kind of existential way, because of course these things have to work together. The structural changes that we need have to work with existential changes in people's consciousnesses. And I think a really tough aspect of this is that as soon as you begin to have a holistic consciousness of the world around you, you begin to be aware of the multiplicity of different demands that can often stand in tension with one another. The fact is that anyone with the best will in the world, when they're trying to do good, will find that they do good in one area and something else suffers. So if you're working on a social issue, you find that the environmental side of things quite often slips, or vice versa, and trying to balance these things is just, it's just difficult. It's just hard. It takes work. It takes mutual correction and this kind of conversation where that some of that correction happens. But one of the difficulties is if we just have a set of often mutually, if not conflicting, then certainly mutually contradictory in some ways demands, and certainly demands which are in tension with one another. What kind of vision or larger sense can you have which can help unite them and help give them some sense of priority? And so the one kind of solution I want to offer to you, I guess, is the cultivation of an idea of home, this concept of home. A concept of home which can serve as a kind of uniting concept that controls some of these tensions, I think, which are often bewildering. Because land, and especially community farms, I think the community farms have a special role in this, can be a home and are already a home in a way which doesn't actually mean there's conflict between the different species and people that live there. One of the coolest projects that we undertook in Jubilee Farm was a BioBlitz, where we tried to count literally every single species of anything that lives on a farm. And it's a good thing we're only 13.5 acres, because any more than that would have been impossible. It was already impossible, of course, but the point is, when you actually count all the different living species, as well as the family of humans that live on the farm, you got pigs, you got goats, and you got everything right down to tiny things which you couldn't see without a microscope, of course. You realize the immense complexity of interconnectedness which exists even in a small patch of land. But each one of those species has to be able to call it home. Each one has to have their own home. And each one has to have their own space. And in a certain sense, each one has to have a bounded space, an appropriately bounded space where they're allowed to cultivate their own lives and flourish. And so you're constantly working with this tension in very practical terms. How can you stop the pigs from destroying the land that you have your crops in? That kind of practical farming question is also deeply ecological and relational one. But if you have an idea of home as a priority, and not just for yourself, but for others, I think that helps to shape the way in which you deal with some of these tensions. It's no longer an abstract sort of numbers game, but it's about a relational mutual respect for something which is deeply real, even if somewhat nebulous. The idea of home, there's no word for home in the Bible. Francis will know this. You get the Hebrew word makom, meaning place, sometimes translated home, or Greek word dwelling, which will sometimes be translated home, or oikos, which is household, sometimes home. But home's a tough concept, but it's so key to all of us. And it's striking as a non-Northern Irishman who's lived a lot in Northern Ireland, how many people refer to Northern Ireland as home? Doesn't matter how long they've left Northern Ireland for. Doesn't matter if they ever plan to go back. They may have been gone for 40 years and living somewhere else. They still talk about Northern Ireland as home. And the idea of home shapes their sense of what their land's about. And I'm glad you mentioned Laudato Si, Francis. Care for our common home. I think the way in which Pope Francis has used the concept of home to shape what could otherwise seem as a bewildering number of priorities in tension with one another is a deeply helpful one. So I think I would want to offer that as a key way to approach some of our challenge. I think it's often done better elsewhere. Please ask me more about my friend Maeri in Malawi, where I lived for many years, who I think does this holistic reconciliation better than anywhere I've ever seen in the world. But I guess to end where I began with Colossians, although home is not a biblical word, it's definitely a biblical concept. And this idea of new creation, of dwelling in Christ, I think does set us towards a future home. And as an evangelical myself, I can definitely recognize the problem of seeing an apocalyptic kind of eschatology, which says, okay, there will be new creation, there will be home in Christ. That means we don't care about the land around us now. I think the only possible approach to new creation in the future is the opposite. We're told to love God and love neighbor. We're not told to like trash what we have and wait for the future. The only possible scriptural way to approach new creation is through cultivating mutually interconnected homes now in the planet that God's given us to live out this life. And I think home as a concept and as a reality is hugely key in that. So thanks, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Matt. I was pleased too that you mentioned Laudato Si, because Pope Francis' whole thing around home and the earth as our home is such an important idea. Karen, would you like to pick up on some of these themes and how you see the solution to the challenges you presented us with?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a wonderful one to follow, this unifying vision of home. Like, you know, I really do think there's something very grounding in that. And it's something that people everywhere can connect with, and non-people also. I suppose the hope that I spoke of before, you know, in understanding that the interconnectedness of the problems exist. It's also, yes, this interconnectedness and our need for collaboration and working together in the responses. And so one of those would be this vision for ecosystem restoration. So we look to our space, our place in nature, if we look to our wider ecosystem and we look to nature, what we actually see is abundance. You know, we live in a world where we think about scarcity a lot, you know, and we have fear, and we have all of these things which contribute to conflict, contribute to division and injustice. But really, when we look at nature, we see, yeah, I'm imagining that eco audit that you carried out in your farm, Matt, like even on a small bit of space, you know, although our farm's 3 acres, so a little bit smaller even still. But you think like what exists in nature, what's possible in nature is just so inspiring and so incredible. And actually it's this abundance of nature that really gives me hope and gives us hope for the future with regards to the problems that we're facing. And we're looking at 2 parts of that puzzle, because there's many parts of it as well, or 2 parts of problems specifically. And one of them is, yes, it's the soil, it's the ground beneath our feet. So if we look at the carbon cycle, and I'm not going to go into the science of it too much now as well, but it's a bit late in the day. But, you know, if you look at the carbon cycle and the problems that we have with the carbon in the atmosphere, one potential solution that has been put forward is looking at our soil, you know. So we have degraded soil throughout the world. We have famously the FAO said in 2014 that we have 60 harvests left, you know, or less still, you know, and the way we've been treating the soil, which is reflective of all those interconnected problems that we outlined earlier, you know, and that were spoken about by the other panelists. The soil actually represents a possibility for addressing the issue of the carbon in the atmosphere. You know, if we were able to restore our soils, bring them back to health, put the biology back in them that we've been wiping out with toxins and very destructive type of farming, then we would be able to respond and bring the level of carbon in the atmosphere down to a much better level, a manageable level in some ways. So this is one scientific theory that is there, or proposal that is out there, and it gives us a lot of hope. I think that because the soil is so crucial, it's crucial to our homes, it's crucial to our way of living and our lives, you know. So the work that Matt outlined on Jubilee Farm of bringing people together to cultivate soil, to work on the land, drawing on Indigenous practices, different ways of working with the soil that aren't as damaging to the ones that we're doing now. All of this provides a sense of community, it provides hope, and actually it provides in some ways solutions to the problems that we're looking at as well. So again, it's all, not to overuse a word, but it's all very interconnected. And the work, I suppose, that we've been exploring mostly is this idea of regenerative agriculture. So an agriculture that not just like we say, you know, we don't just want sustainability, we want something more. We don't want to sustain the system as it is and the situation as it is, because it's not just as it is anyway. And so if we want a true just transition, we're going to move towards more regenerative systems in general. So regenerative agriculture, and agriculture that works with nature, that understands how nature cycles operate and works within that. And if we do that, we have abundance. If we do that, we have hope. We have all of these things, you know. And it's just, for me, it's an extremely inspiring and helpful thing to look to. So looking to nature. And then taking that other piece as well from what you said, Jake, too. I really liked many of the things you said, but this piece about active listening as well. Because absolutely repairing the soil and repairing the planet and healing the planet and all of those things needs to happen. But we also need to heal ourselves, because yeah, it's not going to be sustained, and it's not going to be continued if we're not able to look at what has happened in the first place to bring us to this point. We're not able to look at ourselves, our ancestral traumas, the things that we're living out in our societies as a result of the things that have happened to us, whether it's patriarchy, colonialism, all of these different situations, so looking at how we communicate with one another, looking at how we listen to one another, looking at how we want to go in the future. And I do like, it might be a foolhardy hope, and maybe I have it because I have little ones as well, because there is, there's, as Frances spoke to, like this climate anxiety and climate grief you mentioned, like these are very strong things. These are really big systemic problems that we're looking at, and very overwhelming for most people. If we really allow the information to sink in, it's a very strong thing. And so, yeah, hope is stronger, I think, and it's really important. And I think it's really important that we share those examples and those possibilities and give people a concrete way, like, so these different projects that we're hearing about, I think that's wonderful concrete ways for people to actually, connect and see what they can do.
Thank you very much, Karen. When I was a little girl, which wasn't today or yesterday, my parents liked to listen to a gardening program. And one of the pundits always said, the answer lies in the soil. And clearly the answer does lie in the soil in many respects. So that was very interesting to hear. Zand, can we move on to you to hear how you would solve some of the issues that have been presented this evening?
Sure. And I would echo a lot of what people have been spoken. So maybe I'll go also maybe into I want to take you into atoms and bits and electrons. Which is, so for me, one of the things that we have to do is transition from essentially a net positive and linear economy towards a net zero circular economy in terms of how we relate to our material goods and services, which we're all embedded in. So when I talk about atoms and electrons, if we're talking on computers right now, which are made of atoms that all came from somewhere around the world, probably across 6 continents of supply chains to get to the level of technology that we're talking on right now. And there's electrons flowing through the technology that we're speaking across, which is energy that's being generated somewhere by something, often because we're burning some form of fossil fuel. And basically, if we're going to make that type of transition that we need to, one of the core things that we need to do, I would say, is protect carbon sinks, which are basically oceans and forests. And keep fossil fuels in the ground as much as we can. So particularly from the climate perspective, those are big, significant sort of parts of the global system that we're participating in all the time. And particularly in the global north, we are a one level humans, but we're also embedded in all sorts of systems that we're touching all the time that stretch across the world and that we're kind of interconnected through. So one very practical thing that I would suggest that you could do and look at, which also links to currency, maybe in addition to atoms and electrons, because currency influences the flows of atoms and electrons around the world significantly, is have a look at where your pension is invested, if you have a pension. And if you can move your pension, do that, because very often pension funds, because it generates a lot of profit, are invested in fossil fuels or invested in degrading carbon sinks in various forms and various ways. And even from an intergenerational justice perspective, often us who have either had a pension or are old enough to have a pension, we're investing our money in a future which isn't sustainable for younger generations coming through. So that's one way that you can very practically look at doing something today, would be on an individual level, is to have a look at, where is your pension invested? And write to your pension company and say, hey, can I move it? Or why is it invested in this way? I've just been working with a litigation case, which you can look up if you want, in Australia, it's called McVeigh, who's a guy who's invested in a superannuation fund in Australia and ended up suing his pension company. And they've now created a whole sustainable investment strategy, which has shifted the whole pension market in Australia, because other pension funds are now looking at that, suing of them, saying, oh, we might, and now trillions of dollars are invested in pension companies across the world. And so it begins to shift flows of also what that money is then invested in, and how then, atoms and electrons are flowing through our economy. So that would be one very practical thing that you could do on it as an individual level. I think collectively, we probably have a lot of people on the call, is again, on a very practical level, there are certain forms of solutions, again, on which I think is very prescient, certainly in Northern Ireland right now, is one of the things we can certainly do here, and there's a lot of research that's already done on it at Queen's University and the Climate Commission and so on. The singlest low-hanging fruit from both, you could say from a justice perspective and certainly a climate perspective, is insulating homes across Northern Ireland, which is off-the-shelf technology. Insulation is fairly well known. You can make a lot of it pretty sustainably. And the housing stock in Northern Ireland is horrifically insulated, which is also part of the cost of living crisis very significantly. Most people turn their heating on and it goes straight out their roof. So they're running basically an open tap of energy through their house to keep themselves warm. And we know there's a lot of like heat or eat narrative right now, certainly if you're in Northern Ireland. And so for me, there's a big question of, for example, people on this call, is how do we fight or address poverty, pollution, and prejudice all at the same time? So for me, there's also questions of, can we, all of that work as jobs? Insulation is one of the things as well. You can't really outsource it. You can't really give it over to AI or automate it. It requires people to do it, which means you need, it's jobs. You need to employ people to go and do that work. And I imagine, and I'm sure there's people on this call, if you were to take some of the young people that we know who are disadvantaged in our society, and that there is training programs that they could go through to be involved then in getting a job in insulation, which doesn't have to be about come and save the polar bears, but gives them a dignified form of work, puts income in their pocket, and addresses other issues at the same time, I think is a big question. And potentially even, again, having worked at Corrymeela, I think there's a lot of lessons around how we build a shared future, which is about doing things together, not just talking together. So if you were to bring people together from across communities to do together in that kind of form, I think that there's also questions like that of how we enable shared doing, not just shared talking. I think dialogue is critical, but I also think some of these things, you build relationship also through experience, I think is a big lesson learned from Corrymeela. So, and I think practical interventions, similarly with, I'm sure with some of the farm stuff, bringing people together to do things on the farm together, I'm sure is a huge thing, part of what you're doing at Jubilee Farm. So I would advocate for all of that type of work. Same as planting trees, which again is building carbon sinks. There's lots of different things that we can do in that sense. And there are people out there doing that. I know it hasn't come fully through to the UK, but certainly in England, the British government were testing I think it's, I can look up the exact name. I think it's a green home fund where they were funding insulation across the UK. So there is also significant funding that's coming into this space, which is one of the big questions, is how do you pay for some of this stuff? But for me, those are solutions. What that's missing often is the piece part, or is that how do we build pathways, particularly for communities who are disadvantaged or are left out of these types of spaces, to participate in that type of an economy. So I would say those are a few very practical things that are worth considering. Happy to pick up conversations about some of that, certainly in Northern Ireland or on the island of Ireland. I know the Well Green Building Council is looking at lots of those types of questions as well. So there are lots of entities. I think the wisdom of this type of community is both that inside-outside change and the question of, for me, certainly in Northern Ireland, how do we begin to cultivate a shared future now and bring communities who have been affected by the conflict into this journey, versus it being generally up in a space where there are some people who will benefit more and more and more and generate more and more income, while other people are left behind. And I think that that's a huge ethical question in terms of just transition, about how people are brought along on that journey. So those are a few suggestions that we could pick up. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Zand. And just before we call on Jake to finish this time of addressing some of the challenges, don't forget that you can put questions you may have into the chat function, because we will have, we hope, a brief time for questions when we've heard from Jake. So for you to identify perhaps the speakers you would like to address your question to, or perhaps it's a general question we can address to everyone. But Jake, wind this up for us.
Wind it up. I think that solution is too small a word for what we need. And I say that because one of the things that is painfully clear, as Aldo Leopold, the great environmental writer, said, that to have an ecological education is to discover a world of wounds. And there is so much that has been lost and will be lost. And there is so much, whether it be ancestral lands of Native peoples, coastal lands, certain cultural practices that can no longer be maintained, that are traditional and religious and important, to certain species that generations that come after us will never see. I think one of the things that's really important is actually that we have to sort of learn to bear witness to those losses in the present as an ethical practice. And learning how to do that, I think, is committing ourselves in a different kind of way to a solidarity of bearing witness, of learning about those losses, of bearing the memory of those forward, and learning about how to politically engage in ways to prevent further loss. So there's this act of, I think, metanoia or transformation that tries to pick up the inheritances of history and also look towards the future. My poor politicians are so sick of me because I have them all on speed dial and I call them pretty much every day. But so those practical things where that philosophical kind of attitude really does bear out for me. But I think there's a few things in that. Right before the beginning of lockdowns, I began writing a project on climate grief and ecological grief, partially out of my own personal stories, but also because I was really interested in the ways that so much about the conversation about ecological justice and climate justice is tapped into our emotional intelligence and the politics of our emotions, what we love, what we fear, what we rage over, what we get angry over, what we mourn. And one of the things that I've found is that for the folks who learn to sit in these histories of loss, that it's not simply about giving up or a lack of moral agency. It's about learning to bear with the ambiguities of where we are, that we've lost things, and at the same time, we're living our lives in complex moments of grief and pleasure and joy. And so I really want to reclaim the complexity of joy and creativity in all of this. Maybe not to end on a sort of hopeful, happy note, but learning how to take pleasure in doing this environmental work. Too many times, and I've learned from many of my colleagues in other places in the States, environmentalists are sort of deemed as doomsayers and really morose and pessimistic. And when you look at the histories of climate activism, with the creative ways that people use their buying power, with the kinds of arts and practices that begin to emerge, you get to see just the deep pleasure and joy and creativity of the various different ways that people are using their ethical traditions, their religious heritages, and risking them to transform them in acts of courageous creativity, whether it be in the ways that folks like Greta Thunberg have done that with her own particular agency, or in the really creative and beautiful signs that activists in Extinction Rebellion or climate protests have all put together. I think I see immense creativity everywhere. And I think that's one of the things to dwell on, is that this creativity, this playfulness, this willing to say, yeah, the world is in a rough space, and yet we have this kind of possible connection of joy and pleasure that we might draw on as a source of resilience for ourselves and for each other, I think is really important, and a really important way of listening to our forms of connection with one another. I think that staying with loss, engaging in creativity, is also a practice of risk, and being willing to put our own sense of what we understand our own humanity to mean, of what we understand our own religious traditions to mean, and what we understand our own ethical commitments to mean, to risk those in conversation and in conversational practice, as just was said, with one another, such that our religious and ethical worldviews are transformed. Anyone who does work in interreligious dialogue or interfaith practice recognizes that you can't leave those encounters and relationships unchanged. And I think that that's one of the important things of when I'm engaging in climate justice work in my interreligious contexts, or even in my own tradition, I suddenly begin to find that there are these ethical ideas and religious imaginaries, Francis has spoken to a few of them, that begin to pop up in ways that I haven't seen before. And I can say, yeah, I actually have this stuff here. And I'm heartened by a number. I can't speak of any responses without referencing a billion people who have already shown me so many different ways of responding. And looking for those places in our own traditions rather than necessarily co-opting others, and being willing to risk what our vision of the future looks like. And so maybe I'll stop and with this last kind of point is that I think we really need to critically think about what we're imagining when we imagine the future. Who are we imagining that future with? Who are we imagining that future for? When a politician or a climate activist says we have to do this for our children and our children's children, whose children are we talking about? Are we talking about a larger community? And are we talking about the vast biodiversity of the planet? I usually end my environmental ethics classes with this quote from David Orr, so a second quote for you. And that's this, and he's talking about ecological education, which is what we're all talking about. That the plain fact is that the planet doesn't need any more successful people, but it does need desperately more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of every kind. It needs people who will live well in their places. It needs people of moral courage willing to join the fight to make the world more habitable and humane. And these qualities have little to do with success as we've defined it. So giving up that sense of success is I think, a good start.
Thank you very much indeed, Jake. This has been a fascinating couple of hours, but we have about 15 minutes perhaps for some questions. Now, maybe you're all stunned into silence, but it would be very good to hear some questions from you. Let me start off by, you talked, Jake, just then about who are we doing all this for? And I suppose for those of us who have children and grandchildren and young people in our lives, we really are sort of doing it for them. And we sometimes feel so very helpless. Frances, you started off by talking about the lifestyle changes that we were going to need to adopt. Can you very briefly talk about some of those, and maybe we might give others a chance to come in? What are the lifestyle changes that we as individuals and families can adopt that would be helpful?
I mean, just in a nutshell, I would say that whether we realize it yet or not, climate change is going to be a decolonizing force. The kind of civilization that we've created is not going to be sustainable, period. It uses too many resources, it's too consumptive, and we're going to be forced to change. But I'd like to answer you in a slightly different way about not lifestyle, but maybe some of the ways that have come up in this panel today. Because I felt, because I was going first, that I needed to establish some of these very basic facts about the climate crisis for everyone. But I think it is so important, and that's why it was so wonderful to listen to the rest of you, that in a way, the answer to it really is to keep going into those reserves of joy and peace and to cultivate that. Because this is going to take not just vast transformation, as you said, Jake, not a solution, but a transformation, a revolution, really, not in the violent sense, but a real transformation. And that's going to take a lot of not just energy and imagination, but we need to sustain ourselves for that. We have to start with ourselves. And so in the ecological theology that I'm working on, I really want to call attention, as some of you already have, to how if we're thinking about the entire world as one ecosystem, one interconnected ecosystem, which is what I think that the Hebrew says. Each part is tov, tov, tov. It's good, good, good. And you get to the end and it's tov ma'od. It's really good, really, really good, but as a whole functioning whole. The divine presence pervades all of that. You know, it's everywhere. And I was so taken with what Karen was saying about soil, because we know that on a practical level, you know, agriculture has created dirt, but it hasn't really, traditional agriculture created soil, right? And soil's alive. And so soil has, you know, microorganisms, it has insects, it has the water, it has the root mass, it has all of that. And in the Hebrew, Adam, whom I like to call not just the earthling, but the dirtling, or maybe I want to call it now like the groundling, comes from Adamah. So we're Adam from Adamah, and the Adamah, the earth, the soil is alive. And you made me think about that. And so just finding that kind of joy and that inspiration from thinking about our relationship to the rest of nature. And I'm, of course, trying to think about it in a biblical sense, but also in your farms, in our communities, in our local neighborhoods. What gives me the strength to keep going? Because I get really sad about this sometimes. But now knowing what I know, what gives me the strength to keep going is taking time to have these relationships with the rest of nature. We are nature, but that relationship is what infuses me. And so I answered it in a slightly different way, but we've got to change our lifestyle to integrate that. I think it's the source. It's the source.
Thank you very much, Frances. Several questions have come in about how we listen to different voices. Mm-hmm. How do we give people a voice? Jake, you commented on this. How do we allow other people have a voice? And someone else has come in with Michael from New Zealand. It's interesting to know how many people here are from different parts of the world. Talks about Maori wisdom in this. What is things going to be like for people in, say, 7 generations' time? Anyone like to address any of that very briefly?
I can jump in there a little bit. That the 7 generations is a really helpful symbol and sign and a reality, right, for the 7 generations that have come before us and the 7 generations after us. That we have to think about time differently and think about our sense of the impact of our own ecological bodies as inheritance and as an ancestor. We have to think about ourselves as ancestors in some ways, and that changes one's ethical perspective, to put it in a different kind of time. It's about listening and to listen to the more than human world, or the animal world, or the animate world around us. In us is, I think there's this awkward thing that needs to happen, where we kind of have to acknowledge that we're not the ones who give the voice. That quite oftentimes the dog tells us it's time to eat, or that we see ourselves being watched by another animal, or that there are creatures already in our presence that we haven't acknowledged. And so listening to those voices, but there are also real political and practical ways that can happen in legislation. How do we think about the movement of animal bodies and migrations? and how do we incorporate that into the policy decisions that we make, or in thinking about the actual voices of animal creatures, the vitality of ecosystems. There's a whole new field of acoustic biology that takes recordings of local ecosystems, and you can measure the health of an ecosystem on the sound and the silence. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, right, was a flagship for saying silent ecologies are not great, but there's a whole field on that, and it's worth looking into.
Thank you for that. Someone has put in something about a divestment from fossil fuel. I think it was you, Zand, who mentioned that. And churches and religious communities have made efforts to do this. And you suggested we should look at our pension funds and find out what they're getting up to, supposedly on our behalf. Are there other ways that we can get involved in this? What can we practically do? You are mute, Zand. I mean, maybe you're just breathing deeply as you reflect.
Yeah, I'm breathing deeply and thinking. Well, I would actually just, I can have a think, but I'm sure, I don't know if anyone else on the panel who has a response to that immediately comes in the food space. I'm sure that there is a lot as well in terms of, but I'll take a moment just to consider that if anyone else has anything that they want to immediately offer.
Karen.
I could go just on, to pick up there on policy changes and so on. I mean, is a big move towards regenerative agriculture and organic growing and all of this from a policy level, from an EU, and then being laid out here nationally and across the island of Ireland, also internationally. But obviously it's slow. Policy can be very slow, so educating ourselves and our communities about what it means, and to use not just organic produce, because organic farming can be just as damaging to the soil as well, and to the earth as well. So I suppose like maybe just building an awareness around those things, around regenerative agriculture, different way where your food's coming from, essentially, what your food, where it's coming from, what it's made of. I was very struck by when Zand mentioned earlier about, where your laptop comes from, the sticks. I often think that about, you go for a meal somewhere and the food on your plate, where that comes from. Like if you were to work it all out, like it's mind-boggling, what that takes, the stress that puts on the planet to do that, And I know these options will be taken from us at some point, but it's I think previous to that, without minimizing as well, because I think sometimes in these conversations it goes, it's about the individual making different consumer choices. And yes, the change has to come at a policy level as well. It needs to come at an industry level, it needs to come at many different levels. And it needs to happen, I suppose, from us widening our consciousness and then demanding these different things as well. And I would say as well, in response to that first question about how we live differently, it's I think probably that local and local and local, somebody said local and local and local, but there is something there around, really localizing our connect. It's wonderful that we can all connect with other people around the world, learn from other cultures, see other people, connect with people. It's just beautiful and it's wonderful, and I want us to continue to do that. And it's important that we connect with our local communities and we see what's possible here in our own spaces and support that, so.
Thank you, Karen. David Godfrey has provided us with an interesting question. He says that violence is the recourse of the powerful. He says the crisis raises the issue of violent solutions, and that human history shows that violence is the main recourse of the powerful. How do we take violence seriously at all levels, both global and local? And we touched on this, the war in Ukraine, how that is affecting grain supplies for the world, particularly the developing world. Can any sort of 1 or 2 sentence answers? I notice we're coming perilously near the time that we should say farewell to each other. Violence, how do we address this as an issue?
One sentence.
Why not?
One sentence. The 1 billion for peace pledge is a place to start. It did come out of my work on counterterrorism and on violence and countering violent extremism. And I would give as an example the fact that the Syrian war started as a famine. I'd like one more sentence about what we said earlier, because I was just dying to answer that, which is that, you know, if we are thinking about the 7 generations, like Jake said, education of our young ones is really key. Forest kindergartens, like one of my co-founders has started in Washington State, the education that you're doing at your farms, education of the young ones, and reminding the young ones that we have animal teachers all around us. There's so much abundance, as you were saying, Karen, but there are also so many other ways of learning from, as you know, Robin Wall Kimmerer would say, bear people and tree people and you know, crow people, that we have teachers all around us. And so I think it goes back to that active listening, but education of very young ones is crucial.
Thank you, Frances. Matt, can we ask you to say anything to any of these questions that have come up? It would be really helpful to hear from the perspective of Jubilee Farm.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I could give a couple of reflections, which I think cover a lot of the things that have come up, because I'm really trying to process a lot of what's been said. So I think I'm struck always by the role of relationships in all this. I like the word that Jake used, intimacy, that there's an intimacy with creation that he described in relation to North Dakota. I felt this in relation to Wales, where I'm my home originally. And it's a relational love, actually, of the land and of each other, which only comes through cultivating relationships. Again, the local thing is that, of course, we can engage like this and we can have relationships across technology and across seas, but there's something different about relating to people within the context of land, relating to land itself. And there's a love that comes from that, which actually then animates your approach to the largest scale systemic problems. When you're involved in any sort of farming, you're aware of what it takes to cultivate land, and the amount that the coffee planter in South America or Africa is paid is suddenly a very different question when you've had to work a bit at land yourself and understand the dynamics around the soil, especially, as Karen mentioned. So I think relationships are really key, and again, community farms. I need to be more involved myself at a hands-on level to understand the benefits of this. But community farms are a way of being in relation to the land and each other, which actually then give a love which fires you on to bigger action. I guess the second thing I'll say is I'm really impressed in this conversation about the need to step back and not dive into action. There's often a kind of, I think, very materialist denial of the reality of heart and love and spirit in the way things are solved, as if all we need to do is do something different. But we're doing the wrong things for a reason. Why do we keep doing the wrong things? What is it that's actually at the heart of this that we need to slow down and take account of in our own selves and even on our own hearts? And I guess that's, for me, I think that's the point of the gospel, really. We're starting from a point outside ourselves and saying to God, we've messed up, help, go back to that relationship from which all life comes, and to move from something which is not ourselves. If we keep moving out of ourselves to solutions, we will make the same mistakes again and again and again. And I think that's the note I want to end what I say on anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. And I think that's a wonderful note upon which to finish. Zand, I will let you have one brief word.
Well, just to bridge off that, there's two things that have surfaced for me that I think are important. So one is what is very true and very deep, and is in a lot of the worlds that I've been moving in, which are more materialist, is if we just swap out the dirty battery in the system that we have and replace it with some green stuff, like we just take the energy systems and we just change it to renewable stuff, we're just going to have essentially biofuel bombers, solar powered drones. Like, we're just going to have the same, in terms of violence, the same structures of the way that we've been being with each other. So this movement has to be deeper than some of those material pieces, which is, I think, is very much what people are speaking to. So that's very deep. And one thing that I think is in that, and even relating to some of that, is that there is something very deep for me about finding love for people who have been down the coal mines, or who have been generating some of the systems that we've been benefiting off for a really long time. But in this movement, it's very easy to say, oh, bad people. And there's something about how do we find a place for them in the journey that is actually about honoring the dignity of bringing them along on this journey as well, rather than turning them into villains. And because I think that this movement has to include everybody and all species if we're going to get anywhere. So there's something in that wisdom piece, and noticing, I can notice in my own heart also just that ability on a subtle level to be like, I don't like you because of what you're doing. And that's that root even of the violence that's maybe in me. So I think that's maybe a subtle thing to pay attention to, that I think is maybe an important thing to surface.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you indeed all very much. And we could do a lot worse this evening than to go back and read those first verses from the letter to the Colossians with which Matt started his first presentation. So thank you for that, Matt. Thank you very much for everything you've contributed. We have a huge amount to process and reflect on this evening. I'm really grateful to you. That one thing has really struck me about this panel, that how interconnected you all were. And we've used the word interconnected a huge amount. This is interconnected, that is interconnected, the other is. But you five were too. And you bounced ideas off each other and you echoed each other. And it's been a really fruitful discussion. And for that, all of us who have been listening to you want to thank you so much. It has been thought-provoking, and it has ultimately been hopeful. So thank you very much. And now I must hand over to Jin, who is the person who is operating this from behind the scenes.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you, everybody. This is just to let you know about our next webinar, which will be on the 6th of October. And then Professor Jude Lar Fernando, would you kindly speak about this briefly? And also our new MPhil.
Yes,
Jude?
Thank you very much, Jin. Thank you, Gillian. The next webinar will focus on the ways in which we can enhance interrelationships in Ireland and beyond, particularly in the context of increasingly our experience of diversity, which we experience in Ireland in terms of both secular and diverse faiths. And in that, we will gather a panel of scholar practitioners like today and leaders of faith communities to explore how to be religious and secular in an interconnected way, in a dialogical way, in a liberating way. The reconfigured MPhil in contextual theologies and interfaith relations is based on this approach. When societies become equally secular and multi-religious, how do we address ethical issues ranging from sexual ethics to ecological ethics? And you are most welcome to register for this upcoming webinar. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Jin.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Gillian.
Well, it just is for me to again thank all the speakers, and also to thank those of you who, I was going to say came along to listen, but you know what I mean, it's a wonderful way of connecting. It has been really interesting to realize that among us this evening has been, I think, Michael, you are in New Zealand, and we've had someone from Nigeria and no doubt from other places. We are interconnected indeed through things like Zoom. But if there's one word we take away from this evening, I expect it will be the interconnectedness of all things, and the interconnectedness of all things in Christ. So have a great evening, everyone. Lovely to have been with you, and thank you. Take care.